Hey guys, can you hear me all right? How about now? Better? I have to turn off the feedback on my mic, so unfortunately it's a little difficult for me to tell exactly how loud I'm being. I've run into problems before when I'm running SoundSense in the background and then I'm talking and people can't hear me over the music because I'm talking too softly. Um, I'm going to cover some of the, before we actually get underway actually playing, I'm going to cover some of the basics about file layouts, for example. I know in my Reddit thread I posted about copying my Embark profiles and my World Gen settings into files on your PCs. And I'm going to kind of walk everybody through what I meant by that in case you weren't familiar with how the Dwarf Fortress data structures are laid out behind the scenes in the input files. And then we'll go ahead and use the World Gen settings and the Embark profiles to actually start a game. Tonight I'll probably get through the first season or so. It'll be a little short in terms of playtime because I'm going to cover this stuff on the front end in terms of how to get things set up for this particular world if you're following along at home. For those of you who have installed the Lazy Noob Pack, which I recommend if you're a new player and you've never played Dwarf Fortress before, I personally recommend it. I tried very hard to like Dwarf Fortress in ASCII, and I just couldn't wrap my head around it. All the squiggly symbols, it was a nightmare. Playing on a tile set is a little more like playing a stripped down, 8 or 16-bit era game with significantly more, mechanics depth. So graphically, you're looking at something, an old school Nintendo game, for example, uh, with all of the mechanics that you would normally get from Dwarf Fortress. I know that there's a lot of purists out there who insist that you must play in ASCII, but I don't even play Angband with just the ASCII. I play with tile sets in most old roguelikes, and Dwarf Fortress is no exception. A little bit of dyslexia, and suddenly you're not looking at the same layout that everybody else is, and it just gets really, really hard for me to play that way. So, for those of you who've never seen it before and who may or may not be using the Phoebus tile set that you see me listed here, when you go in, when you've installed Dwarf Fortress, Phoebus actually has a tile set assembler that lets you figure out what you want for various tiles. So for those of you at home who may not have seen this before, I'll go ahead and fire up the assembler and just to kind of give you a view of what it's going to look like when we actually get to the game set while I'm waiting on the 3 minutes before my stream officially starts here. So for example, the Phoebus tile set actually incorporates a whole set of different wall and layout styles, for example, that do different things with respect to minerals or walls. Um, Depending on what you pick, you may get, a different change in the water, or if I were to set the color, I can set the water to be brighter or darker. These are mostly this is a purely aesthetic choice, how you like it. So while the symbols may be a little different in mine, depending on what type of wall style you've chosen, you're going to get, for example, here colonnaded, crenellated, round. The original Phoebus set used a square 3D, I think. There's different styles here, and the walls are still walls. I mean, this is basically the equivalent of the ASCII overlaid on top of the Phoebus tile set. Um, the different ore symbols up here at the left, that's what this is going to cover, what the different ores, for example, look like. All of this stuff is personal preference. ASCII purists are going to tell you that you need to play with ASCII. Uh, a lot of folks don't like the Phoebus tile set and they use Mayday. Whatever you guys personally prefer, just go ahead and when you're done, don't forget to, if you're running on the Phoebus tile set, don't forget to save any updates you've made so it'll save out the actual changes to the tile set. all you're really doing is picking out a selection of things and saving them to the tile set that the game will then subsequently import. Now, one of the things I'm going to cover tonight when we do this is I'm going to go through what these files here in the init folder are primarily used for. For those of you who've never played Dwarf Fortress or who haven't really gone very far into it, these are files that change a lot of how Dwarf Fortress handles various game events. For example, world generation, or the profiles, the basic profiles you'll get for your dwarves. For those of you who might be following along at home, who were getting out on the Reddit thread, I'll pull it up real fast and show you what I'm talking about. If you were downloading my Embark profile and World Gen settings from the Google Drive folder I set up earlier, you can paste those directly over this. All of this stuff, yeah, those of you asking, those of you who are watching there at home, all of this stuff comes with the Lazy Noob Pack. I don't have it installed because I know I like Phoebus, and there's no point installing all the other tile sets. I manually edit my own init files, so I don't need Lazy Noob Pack to do that for me. Some of the things that you can do in Lazy Noob Pack are a whole lot easier to do with it than they are separately. I'm going to cover, since it's now 7 o'clock and we're going to get underway, I promised some of the folks there in the Reddit thread that I would cover how to get my settings into your init files. If you go to your base install folder, wherever you've installed Dwarf Fortress at, and you open it up, there's a folder called Data, which contains all sorts of various data types, data things that you're not normally going to mess with. But one of the folders you are going to care about heavily is the init folder. In init, there are two files, World Gen and Embark Profiles. And these are the folders these are the files that you're going to modify to incorporate my settings. So, for example, let's say you pulled down the World Gen seed just to create the world. Maybe you don't care so much about my settings, but you're gonna actually look at the world I've created, so that you're looking at the same map I am. Way down at the bottom of my file, all of these things are called tokens. They come in different flavors. In World Gen, they're World Gen tokens. The tokens for Embark profiles are different, but they all have these little braces, these little square brackets around them. And each one of these sets of parameters corresponds to one predefined map, for example. So here's medium custom is the default map that I've been tinkering with. It's a medium-sized map that I've customized some of this stuff and then saved it as a different profile. Moral is one I picked up from one of the Bay 12 users. When you open up Dwarf Fortress, let me go ahead and pull it up real fast so you can see what it looks like in the game here. And you say, hey, I'm going to design a new world with advanced parameters. What it's going to do is it's going to come up and give you a list of the parameter sets that you've imported. So here's moral, and there's medium custom. And the one that you're importing for me is this one down here at the bottom called flat volcano. You're welcome to play with all of the others that you like, but my suggestion, if you start playing around with these for yourself, is that you don't actually change the original. All these pockets, smaller, all these ones at the top are the defaults that come with the game. I strongly recommend that you use the copy parameter set before you start modifying, and leave these untouched. That way you can always go back to the default settings for creating an advanced world. Now, once you've got those imported, and I'm going to bail out of Dwarf Fortress because I don't need it running for this section. Once you've got those imported into the init file for their respective things, so in the World Gen folder, it's this last setting here, this last compilation of tokens, Flat Volcano. All you do to get this world imported in your seeds is grab all of the tokens that go with that set, all of them, copy them, and open your copy of that file up, and then paste them at the bottom. Make absolutely sure you get this top token, this World Gen token, because when Dwarf Fortress reads through these, it hits this World Gen token, and it knows that all of the tokens after that are part of the World Gen token type. Effectively, these correspond to all of the different menu options in the advanced parameters set. So, for example, if I open Dwarf Fortress up again, and I go back into Design New World, and I tell it I want to edit the parameters set for Flat Volcano, you're going to see the seeds that it's set up to use, how many embark points you get, what end year your profile will, automatically stop at. There's a host of environmental conditions you can modify. You can play with these to your heart's content. The worst thing that could possibly happen if you tinker with these too much is that you'll start getting rejects and the worlds won't actually be viable for play. And I'm going to show you how to monitor that, and then the wiki will cover how to correct for it. Actually modifying these parameters on the fly is not normally something I do. I normally get a world I like and stick with it for a while. If you've never played Dwarf Fortress before, your world will be as pristine as mine. If you have played before and you keep using the same world, all of your dwarf fortresses and all of your adventurers effectively play in the same world. So if I played on Flat Volcano and I created a dwarf fortress, and then after I got tired of that fortress and I either abandoned it or it got lost to goblins or everybody starved, whatever, and I then went on and played an adventure, that fortress is actually on the map in exactly the place where I built it, and I could actually visit it as an adventurer, explore, plunder the ruins of my old fortress, confiscate all that stuff, and take it back to some other place and sell it. And after I got tired of playing with my adventurer, I could start another fortress and reclaim the old fortress and play on the same site, or create a completely separate fortress. The only thing you can't do is play an adventurer at the same game time as your fortress. You can only play a world in one mode at a time. So you can't have, for example, an adventurer active in a world where there's also an active fortress. It just doesn't work that way. The best you could do would be to clone the world off and have two different versions of the same world. Now, in addition to the Flat Volcano World Gen seed, the other thing you're going to want to incorporate is the Embark profiles. And you don't need these. These aren't essential. World Gen is if you want to play on the same map. Embark profiles is purely for having the same setup when you start that I have when I start. So you're going to find one that's called Raw Goods Base here, and this is the Embark gear that I'm going to take by default if I don't change it. Now, here in a minute, I'm actually going to make some modifications to it beyond what you see here in this text file. But this is what would be on the screen when we first start. So, for example, I'm going to have 4 miners at level 5. I'm going to have a 5th dwarf who has masonry and stonecraft at 5, a carpenter, and a weaponsmith and grower. And I'll walk you through why I do this and why I'm bringing all of these different pets and items down here below, so that you can kind of follow along with what I'm doing and why I'm doing it as we go. In addition to these 2 files, which are basically just all about how to get to the world that I'm creating, you're also going to see init, de-init, and announcements, and these control various features of how Dwarf Fortress interacts with you, the user, as well as some settings that you can use to control your experience. So, for example, in init, I normally turn sound off. I'm running down here at the bottom. These 2 icons here are sound sense. I use them for music and sound. I don't need the Dwarf Fortress sound playing as well. I play windowed. You can play in full screen. There's nothing wrong with playing in full screen, but I find that since I switch in and out of Dwarf Therapist on a regular basis, switching out of the windowed version is easier for me and doesn't seem to have as many issues as switching out of the full screen mode. If you're playing the Lazy Noob Pack, these settings will be set for you by whatever tile set you've played around with, as well as these down here for the full screen mode. You will get various print modes. I'm running standard. I think the default is actually 2D, but it's been a while since I've tinkered with this, and I can't remember if 2D is by default. This little section here explains, outside the tokens, explains what these print modes do in terms of how your graphics are displayed on the screen. I typically run standard. Those of you with older computers or running under different settings may get better results with one of the others in terms of frame rates, for example, once you get to that point. I do keep an FPS counter on my map. That's mostly just for my benefit, so that if I do something that, tanks the FPS, and there are things you can do, like piping fluids, for example, that I recognize immediately that I've done something that's going to cause an FPS-related issue, and it's not just the game getting ready to crash out on me, for example. pretty much that's, I think, the majority of all the stuff I touch in here. These are very high-level sorts of modifications to the game. They're not the kind of things you're going to change on a day-to-day basis. You typically set this stuff up and then never mess with it again. The dinit file here in this file here is going to have several settings that I highly recommend new players look at touching. In particular, autosave, auto backup, and autosave pause, as well as initial save and pause on load. I highly recommend using these settings right here. You can change them. There are other settings the descriptions will tell you. I prefer to keep a save backup once a season. That minimizes the amount of rollback I have to do if I lose my fortress. I automatically back up my saves so they're not constantly being overwritten by the newest one, and I pause on save so that if the game goes to save and I get up and go get a soda, when I come back my dwarves haven't all died to a siege I wasn't expecting. I keep an initial save for every site I start, and that's solely so that if I decide, hey, I really like this site, I want to come back to it, and I don't want to rebuild the world each time, I can just load up that initial save and have a copy of the world as it was when my wagon arrived. I leave on the vast majority of these. Some of these features are not implemented, like, for example, economy is actually not in the game, even though it says yes. Now, when you're modifying those advanced parameter sets and you want to know why your worlds are being rejected, and it will tell you, how many you reject, you can turn log map rejects to yes, and it will store a file in your Dwarf Fortress folder that will list your map rejects and the reason why each one was rejected, because a lot of times it'll run 500 rejects and you won't know what you've changed that's caused the parameters to be outside the bounds. Logging them will enable you to troubleshoot your world gen process. So if you're looking for a particular type of world, if you're modifying your settings to try and force a particular type of terrain or event, then logging your map rejects will let you play around with that and know when you've gone too far, which boundaries you're hitting, whether you want to ignore those boundaries or simply leave them in place and change your settings. The default embark rectangle, I think, is actually a 4x4. I run on a fairly beefy PC, and I liked having lots of space to play with, so I bumped mine up to a 5x5. Those of you with older PCs who may not be able to handle a high population dwarf fortress running with lots of pets and moving around in lots of open space, you may want to embark with a smaller rectangle. As always, if you increase the size of your fortress space, you're going to drastically decrease the performance later on when you have 300 dwarves and 300 turkeys and 300 cats and 300 dogs, etc., etc. So this initially you're going to see my FPS, it's going to be fairly high, but as we go and you end up with more and more things moving around, more and more things going on in the fortress, you're going to end up with lower performance. The size of the embark rectangle you use will have a significant impact on that later on. It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's actually much, much greater than that. I typically don't mess with all of these other settings in here. You can play around with them. These have alterations to the pathfinding cost for traffic designations. This controls how tightly your dwarves mess around with moving things to barrels. I find the default settings are more than sufficiently aggressive for my purposes. I do disallow pets by default because it lets me use burial receptacles without having to think about it. If I want to bury a pet, it doesn't stop me. This simply says if I turn a burial receptacle on, if I open up a coffin for burial purposes, citizens come first. I have to manually allow a pet to be buried, otherwise the pet won't be buried at all. That's okay for me. I don't really like to use up my coffins on dogs and cats and sheep and so forth. Now, I have in here, baby child cap is set to 0. For those of you who are at home who may have had your dwarves swamped out by 40 migrant waves consisting of nothing but children, yeah, this is how you fix that problem. Unfortunately, this is a soft cap, so what you'll end up with is a situation where your population cap is 200, for example, and at 199 dwarves in your fortress, you get a wave of 70. And of those, there's 100 of them, they're kids. I want to say the baby and child cap settings by default are like 10 and 1,000, which means that you can have up to 10 children born, and then, or as many as 1,000 times the number of adult dwarves in your fortress, and basically the lower number matters. So if it's 10 and then 1,000, the lower number is going to be your bound. Personally, there's not until Toady implements dwarven childcare or dwarven schools. Children are a real nuisance in the game. Having your female spear dwarves give birth mid-battle and then promptly use their children as shields, and they will, is really, really bothersome to me. Not from a moral standpoint, I think it's hilarious from that standpoint. From a mechanics standpoint, however, it's terrible. There's no way for you to control dwarven mom being pregnant unless you monitor all your dwarves like a hawk, and frankly, that level of detail is a little bit too far for me to really worry about. Most of these other settings are aesthetic. There are several down here, like, for example, traps. If you're playing adventurer mode and you set up traps on your fortress, the traps will affect you as an adventurer, so you can actually turn off traps so that you don't dissect yourself as you go to plunder your old ruins. If you're going to play an adventurer in one of your fortresses at the early point, I would set this to no. The settings on, or the traps you're going to build are incredibly lethal to goblins, and they are just as lethal to your adventurers. For those of you playing defaults, this is not the default setting. There will be lots of children by default. I won't have any other than what come with my migrants. If my migrants come with children, I'll get them, but no dwarves will give birth in the middle of my fortress. When Toady implements dwarven schools, dwarven childcares, dwarven babysitters, I'll be all over setting this back to default, but until then, it's just an annoying feature that doesn't really add anything to the fortress, in my opinion. Okay, now I've covered World Gen, Embark profiles, init, dinit. Announcements are those things that pop up at the bottom of your screen and tell you what's going on. Now, I love announcements, but you'll notice I'm running SoundSense, and part of the reason I'm running SoundSense is very specifically to keep track of announcements that I might otherwise miss, because they're being stored in some screen somewhere, or because they flash by when there's 14 announcements all going to the screen at once. But what this does is control what announcements get displayed, whether the game pauses, whether it gets logged, whether it recenters your screen. All of those things are controlled here in the announcements thing. And I'm not going to go through what each one of these is, but for example, let's say I dug into an area that was next to a river. 1 square away from that, it's going to cancel that job and warn me that there's damp stone there that may potentially flood my fortress if I dig too far, and it's going to recenter my screen, but I don't have it set to pause. I think the default is pause and recenter, and I do a lot of construction from time to time around both lava and water, and so you'll see dig cancel warm and dig cancel damp are both recenter, the R, but not pause, P. They're notified in adventurer mode, they're notified in dwarf mode, but I don't actually have it pause my game. The problem is that if you're digging under a river, for example, you'll get 1 pause every time your dwarves dig out a new section that shows damp stone, and there's a lot of sections you're going to dig through, so you're constantly unpausing the game over and over again. The cancel is not avoidable. You can't stop them from canceling this, as far as I know. They will cancel the job regardless. So this is just a recenter for a, hey dummy, did you pay attention to the fact that your dwarves are getting ready to cancel that job or not? I don't actually pause for it. Okay, I've covered the basics of the init file. When you save your game, there will be a save folder out here. You'll see multiple save folders when I get underway for the different save games as it backs them up for me. Let's spend a moment covering the basics of the various add-on tools that I use. First off, SoundSense has 2 windows here. This is a general status page for SoundSense. You won't really use this, but if you're watching it at any point, you'll see that it's monitoring events in the game log. And so, for example, when I started a new game, when I went into the Create World Gen settings, it noticed that I was starting a new game and prepared to play any events, sounds, or music that are based on that. You'll hear SoundSense fire up here in a minute when we get underway. Please, guys, let me know if it's a little too loud. I've changed my volume settings a little bit, and there's several of you out there watching now, so I'm hoping I can get good feedback on whether my levels are adjusted appropriately. You can see here I've got it set down fairly far. I think the default is 0 or -6, and I'm fairly far down. All SoundSense does is play sounds based on game events. So when my dwarves discover a new type of rock as they're digging, SoundSense plays a little sound for that event. So not only do I get the little flashing text announcement at the bottom, I also get a sound that plays in my headset so I can actually hear what's going on in my fortress as I go. It makes it easier for me to follow what's going on when I've got 300 dwarves and they're all doing umpty bazillion things at once. It's not essential. You can certainly play without SoundSense, but for those of you who are used to sound providing useful feedback in your games, right now that's a mechanic that's kind of lacking in Dwarf Fortress in its current state, and SoundSense goes a long way to bringing the game into the modern era, so to speak, in that aspect. In addition to SoundSense, one of the ones you're going to see me use over and over again is Dwarf Therapist. Let me go ahead and I'll skip over this one briefly for now. I'll just kind of cover it. Basically, this allows you to set dwarven labors and tell a dwarf what jobs he's allowed to do. And if he's not allowed to do them, he won't touch them. So if you tell all your dwarves nobody's allowed to grow crops, nobody grows crops in your fortress. It doesn't matter how many times you order them to be planted, nobody touches the seeds. Dwarf Therapist effectively makes a cleaner, easier to use interface for the labor assignment tasks that you can do in Dwarf Fortress. You can manually assign all of the labors. Dwarf Therapist does not really allow you by default to do anything that you wouldn't normally do. It simply automates a lot of tasks that require a lot of repetitive button pushing. I love Dwarf Fortress, but Toadie's interface is terrible in a lot of aspects, and this is one of those aspects that's really been dealt with well by third-party mod creators. Dwarf Therapist gets major props all through the Dwarf Fortress community. I highly recommend it. Frankly, I don't even start playing Dwarf Fortress after a new version until Dwarf Therapist is updated. And I do my best to try and help those folks get their memory layouts updated so that we can get Dwarf Therapist up and running as soon as possible. Now, in addition to those, I also run DF Hack. And DF Hack is effectively an add-on, a command line interface. This is DF Hack here. That adds various plug-in events for Deathwatch. I've been going for about 20 minutes today already. I really haven't started playing. I've just been covering the basics of how the init files work, for example, and DF Hack and the various utilities. You haven't really missed me actually playing yet, so if that's what you're watching for, stay tuned. We're not there yet. DF Hack is a command line interface that comes with various plugins. So let me show you some of this stuff here. You can hit question mark and it will tell you all about, what it is. If you hit LS as though this were a Linux interface, it will display all the plugins you've got loaded. So as you can see, there's a vast number of these that have been coded, and all of these things have various effects. Some of them are outright cheats, or things that affect the game in all sorts of ways that you might not expect. So for example, there's actually a DF Hack command here called Catsplosion, which will take any cats on your map and make them multiply like crazy. Obviously, there's no real reason you'd want to do this. It's just one of those things that if you want to test, for example, frames per second, or FPS, frames per second on your map, you could save your game, load it up, and then perform a Catsplosion and see what happens to your frame rate. There are a bunch of these plugins that I'll use along the way, both to explain how the world is laid out on an Embark, as well as to actually play the game. Some of them are simple convenience features like Dig V, which will mark an entire vein for digging. You can do it one tile at a time as your dwarves expose each tile as you go, but using Dig V allows me to mark the whole vein and go do something else while my dwarves go mine it all out. And I don't have to keep checking back with the mine over and over and over and over and over again when I could be doing something else. It automates what should, for the dwarves, be an automated task, but there's no good way to automate it in Dwarf Fortress by default. Later on, I'll probably eventually get into touching some of these more in-depth and powerful tools. We'll eventually, I think I'm going to try and mess around with workflow. You'll see I have Dwarf Monitor installed, as well as all of the updated versions of the plugins from Falcone. Dwarf Monitor you'll see almost immediately when I start up. Basically, it lists by default, even if you don't do anything, it will list the happiness of your dwarves right there in the Dwarf Fortress screen. And I'll show you this kind of stuff later. Suffice to say, for an hack is a handy tool, both for fixing bugs as well as for manipulating the game directly in ways that you might do with a command line console in Quake or other games. This is more or less identical to that. It's not quite as full-featured as you might expect from that description, but it covers a lot of stuff, and there's very little that you're going to want to do that's not already here. For those of you who do want things to do that aren't here, I highly suggest going out to the DF Hack site and pitching in, because this is an open source tool. They love to get new programmers to help them expand what can be done with DF Hack. Okay, at this point I've covered the basics of all of my mods. I've covered, or my utilities. I've covered the basics of DF Hack. I've covered the init files. I've shown you where your save files will be stored. Let's start looking at how we actually play this game. Now, when you start up Dwarf Fortress, you're going to be presented with this menu by default. I've actually cleared out all my save games, so I have the same menu you would get when you first started. And if you're following along at home and you've installed my Embark profiles in my World Gen settings, that's what we're going to use today. You can, of course, create new world, and I'll show you briefly what that menu looks like, those of you who've played before. I highly recommend, if you're going to do this and you're a new player, that your mineral occurrence is everywhere, and that your savagery is, on the low end, your number of beasts is on the low end, and so forth. This is nice, and there's nothing wrong with playing a map via the direct method, but there's nothing that stops you from going into the advanced settings, where you get much, much finer, much more detailed control than this method. So in the Design a New World, where I've already imported my World Gen seed, what you're going to see is a World Gen seed called Flat Volcano. And this map is actually one I pulled down from... I've heard that CloudSat, but I've never actually seen that it limits the chance of getting coal myself. It does assume that you are not getting volcanism everywhere, and that's kind of a detailed topic for this tutorial. But if you're running a really high volcanism, then you will cut coal out. But short of that, you're not going to cut yourself out of coal. You'll only find coal in sedimentary areas, and depending on where you're embarking there, if you're not embarking in lowlands, for example, you're just not going to see coal. It's not on the map. You can play around with those settings to your heart's content. I haven't actually used the basic World Gen creating in probably 5, 6, 10 versions now. Not since 31.12 have I used the basic. I've been using the advanced World Gen settings ever since then. In Flat Volcano, I've modified... This is a modified stat I pulled down from Reddit. It's actually not mine. I pulled it down from someone else. You can go through and tweak all these settings to your heart's content. In particular, some of the modified settings I prefer. I have a large number of layers. I'm using the Phoebus tile set, Deathwatch. In particular, I have a large number of layers above the first cavern, so I'll have a large amount of stone and soil above the first cavern. For those of you who want to implement a very vertical, efficient fortress, it's probably worth tweaking this setting here, even if you don't touch anything else, to have a few levels. What this basically does is it guarantees that between the surface and the first cavern, I'm going to have 15 layers of soil plus stone to mess around with. I might have more, but I'll never have less. Likewise, between all the other cavern layers, I've got about 5 between each one of those. So my caverns have some separation between them. That'll allow me to build between them, for example, and not have a situation where cavern 2 or layer 2 ends and layer 3 begins immediately, where your caves can theoretically even overlap to a much greater extent than otherwise. It doesn't keep them from connecting, but it does mean that you're going to have some stone in between them to build in. In particular, generally speaking, you might want to look into what these various settings do. This one has 2 caverns. The default is 3. There's nothing... as long as you have at least 1 cavern, you will want at least 1. Your dwarves will have underground plants. If you set cavern layers to 0, you'll actually cut your dwarves off from any underground plants at all, and that can drastically impact how you play the game. These minimum counts here are a lot of what will cause your world rejections. That's why if you're going to tweak these, I suggest you go ahead and track why your rejections are occurring so you can mess around with it. These number of types have to do with how many different types of demon, vampire, were-beast. So, for example, this particular World Gen setting has 26 different types of were-animals, and they might be were-tapirs, were-sharks, were-whales. There's a vast quantity of them. 26 of them will be picked at random, seeded in the world, and could theoretically appear. The mineral scarcity, notice that this is a scarcity setting, not an occurrence setting. So low means more minerals. Can go down to about 100. I've never found a problem with running at 100, but this one just happens to be at 500. It works great because in this particular map I'm looking for, it generates the exact site that I'm going to use. So I'm not planning to change this, but I've messed around with everything from 100 all the way up to 1,000. When you get too low, I don't like surviving on wood and stone alone. I think dwarves should have metal that they don't have to take off goblin backs. Your mileage may vary. Likewise, these ranges affect what the probability of a given amount of volcanism or temperature or these different settings you're going to see. And these seeds actually control which world you'll get. So if you're planning to have the same map over and over again, you have to make sure that the seeds are set to be the same every time. They're just random letter strings. I don't expect you guys to actually copy them in. That's why I uploaded the World Gen seed when we did this the first time. Now, I don't want to make any changes here, so I'm going to back out real quick and come back in so that I make sure any accidental changes I might have made are not saved. And then we're going to hit entered here to pick out the flat volcano setting, and it will start creating worlds. Now, not all of the worlds are going to be accepted, and as you'll note here at the top, it immediately rejected the first one. And you should now hear sound sense coming in with the World Gen music. Let me know, guys, if it's a little too loud. I'm going to assume that if you guys are okay with it, we're going to let it play at that volume, otherwise I'll turn it down further. Rejected worlds are worlds that weren't playable or didn't meet criteria for some reason. So, it got 11 more worlds, and then all of a sudden it started in on a rejection and said, "Nah, I can't do that world." Reasons for world rejections vary. There's all kinds of them. They range from no neutral aligned mountains to, you don't have any mountains at all. There are all kinds of various failures. Ignore the whiting out here, guys. When I hold down the push to talk key, Dwarf Fortress doesn't interpret that, and Windows 7 thinks it's crashed or hanging, and so it whites the screen out on me. That's just a quirk of their interaction. It's not actually a function of the game. Please just ignore it. You can see, for example, rivers being created here. The reason I use a tile set is that it makes it easier for me to determine at a glance what I'm looking at. So this is swampland, forests, hills, mountains, tall mountains, peak, some badlands here and here of various types. These are marshlands. Those of you playing ASCII, you're going to see an entirely different version of this. I give you kudos for being able to play it, but like I said, a little bit of dyslexia goes a long way with Dwarf Fortress, and it makes it very hard for me to play. So tile set it will be. This will go ahead and create the world, and I'm going to run about 120 or 130 years of history into the game. So what you're seeing here is that it's actually running the game's history, simulating events that occurred between the various historical figures, and it keeps track of how many actually die during World Gen. So this actually lists, the 1,500 so far, elves, dwarves, humans, and goblins that have been massacred by virtue of various wars, beast attacks, and so forth. You might be wondering why these mountains are yellow. These are good aligned mountains. This is a good aligned marshland and good aligned shrublands. This is a good aligned forest versus a neutral forest over here. Neutral hills, neutral marshlands. So you can see the coloration difference allows me to tell at a glance what's going on in World Gen. Now, those of you playing ASCII at home, of course, are going to insist that you can do the same thing. Good for you. This is a glacier. So this is a frozen wasteland up here surrounded by marsh. This is an inland lake or ocean. There's some human civilizations cropping up here around the river. There's a goblin fortress here. A couple of caves where beasts might settle. Now, if you come back and you play an adventurer later on this same map, you're going to see the same world. This world will be there until you actually get rid of it or recreate it under a different folder. So you can actually play in the same world repeatedly, starting multiple fortresses. Joey P, I don't remember. I think it's a 257 by 257. It's actually out there in the Reddit thread. You can actually pull in my World Gen settings and use them to create this exact world if you're looking to follow along at home. It's run about 140 years. That's good. I think the defaults for this setting, I have it ending at 250. And the problem is if I let it run, it gets slower and slower towards the end. And I know you guys didn't, come here just to see World Gen run for an hour and a half. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel it a little early right now. And it will come back here in a second and tell me that World Gen has effectively ended. And it'll ask me if I want to use or abort. Abort will take you back to the menu and discard this world, so I'm not going to do that. So we're going to use the world as it exists. Continue will say, oops, I hit escape by mistake, and it'll just pick up where it left off. It'll write out the last bits of civilization. It'll ask me if I have any questions, or I can look through the world here. I can kind of scroll around and see where things are in the world. If I wanted to maybe export my own map, for example, I can do that. This export down here at the bottom, this P for export image info, if you're generating a world and you want to be able to reuse it, you can do that from here, or you can do it later when you actually start the game. I'll show you how to do it from there. This will allow you to export the World Gen seed later on. Say, for example, you start a game, you play a fortress, and then you go, oh, I really want to start that world all over again, and you didn't keep the settings. You can actually export the World Gen seed from an existing world, and that saves you from having to do something like upload the world or, try and play in the same world after you've created a fortress that you no longer need or care about. I'm going to go ahead and accept the world, and then I'll show you how to export the seeds after you've started. If you hit P, it will do all of these things now, but I'll show you how to do it from the menu. Now, there'll be a moment here where it'll kind of white out. Don't pay attention. As Dwarf Fortress is saving the game, it's not taking keyboard input. And Windows 7 confuses the push-to-talk key with a problem with Dwarf Fortress, and it'll white out on me again here in a moment. There are three basic modes to Dwarf Fortress. There's the Dwarf Fortress mode I'm actually going to demonstrate tonight. There's an adventurer mode for those of you who are familiar with NetHack, Rogue, or Angband, for example, where you can play as an adventurer rather than the more SimCity type style of play of Dwarf Fortress. You can actually adventure in the world of your fortresses, complete with visiting the fortresses you've had in that world in the past. The third mode isn't really so much a game as it is a history viewer. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Start Playing, and it asks which of the three modes I want to mess around with. Dwarf Fortress I'll be demonstrating tonight. Adventurer I'm not really even going to cover. If you've played NetHack or you've played Angband, this is like a slightly less abstracted version of those. It's all of the chaos and mayhem you would expect from Dwarf Fortress condensed down to single adventurer size. And right now it's the primary focus of Toadie's development. Most of the Dwarf Fortress features are effectively sitting right now while he works on things that primarily support the adventurer mode in general. Legends is a history viewer, and I'll go into that briefly here. It allows you to take a look at the history of your world, events that have happened, people who died, the era in which these events occurred, information about structures and civilizations and underground regions. All of this stuff is incredibly detailed. So, for example, there's a female dragon called Sloron. Yeah, I'm not even going to try. And here is her entire history, her related entities, people she's killed, 23 notable kills, 4 other kills, related sites is where her lair is. So, for example, if I were playing an adventure and I wanted to try and kill this dragon, I would go to this place, and if this dragon was still alive, that would be where I would be looking for it. Needless to say, there's a vast, vast quantity of history here, far more than you will probably care about. My history is set to discovered by default, so all of my history is known. Those of you playing an adventurer who care to dig into the random history and want it all to be a surprise, you can set that stuff to be not discovered. But down here at the bottom is the part I really was interested in for you folks there at home. You can export a picture of the world, a map, as well as the map gen info. And exporting the map gen info is how you pull the seed out of the game after you've started. Hyperhopper, I'm kind of going over the menu. This is for folks who really haven't played at all and aren't really sure how to get underway. We haven't actually embarked yet. If you're looking for that, stay tuned. I'm not there yet. We've still got about 45 minutes to an hour left, at least, before I'll knock off for tonight. So never fear, you're going to see me get to embark tonight. I'm just kind of explaining the various game modes and so forth. Okay, and so we're going to go in and start Dwarf Fortress. It will import the world that we've created and bring you up to the Where Do You Want to Embark Today site. So here on the right, you're going to see this is the world. That little blinking X is where in the world I am. This region is a sub-breakdown of that world tile. This local area is a breakdown of where this X in the regional area is. So what I'm looking at here is where I'm going to embark. If I embarked right now, I would embark in this square here, which is a subregion of that X, which is a subregion of that X, which ought to give you an idea of exactly what the scale of the world in Dwarf Fortress really is. The site that I'm looking for tonight's little tutorial is one that I've picked out in advance. I've used it before. I'm fairly familiar with it. It has a volcano on a flat surface, so it's actually a very, very newbie-friendly area. About the only thing it doesn't have by default are sand and coal, and neither of them is essential to doing things later down the road. We're going to embark on that volcano right there at the far right edge of the world. There are about two-thirds of the way down the right-hand side. There's two volcanoes side by side, and the right-hand one, if you position your local area in this configuration right here, has the volcano at the northeastern corner and a brook running through the actual embark site. This readout on the right tells you about the biomes in your map, and you can see down here at the bottom F1, F2. I can switch between them. So F1 is that flashing area here, and it's a tropical shrubland. It tells you how many, roughly what you can expect in terms of number of trees, how savage or good or evil the terrain is. It tells me that my embark square here includes a brook and a volcano. It tells me that I can expect to find clay, that I'll have about one layer of soil, and that I'll have multiple metals, shallow and deep. Likewise, if I hit F2, it'll pull up the other half of this particular embark. In this case, it's going to show me that this also has clay and little soil with multiple shallow and deep metals. But it's a tropical coniferous forest, so whereas the first one is only a woodland, a lightly wooded kind of area, the coniferous forest is heavily forested, so there's lots and lots of trees in that area. Other vegetation is thick on the ground and so forth. Both of these areas are neutrally aligned. That's why they're wilderness as opposed to, sinister or good. And the savagery level is somewhere in the middle. It's not at the low end and it's not at the high end. The more savage and the more evil your terrain is, generally speaking, the harder it's going to be to embark in that area. So, for example, let me see if I can find an evil terrain for comparison purposes here. Not having a whole lot of luck finding evil here. I haven't really looked on this map before. Here, this sand desert, untamed wilds, that's a high savagery area. It's neutrally aligned, but you can expect to see giant animals and giant animal men as opposed to the more and I use the term loosely, normal quantity of wildlife that you might see in a less savage area. In the Phoebus tile set, this eye here represents a necromancer's tower. If I were to embark here, I would expect to see zombies laying siege to my fortress at some point in the near future, and depending on how close to that I was, it might very well be the very near future. If I were an adventurer and I wanted to become a necromancer, I'd have to seek out this tower and, pillage it for its secrets. These calm surroundings areas here, this sand desert, just as an example, is on the low end of the savagery scale. Keep in mind, even low savagery areas in Dwarf Fortress aren't really safe, they're just safer, and it's a relative scale all the way around, no matter what you do. Wow, not sure there's any evil on this map anywhere. I haven't seen any. Okay, we're going to skip that because I don't think I've seen any evil at all in this entire scanning around I've been doing here. Basically, if I were to see purple, there's a purple color that it uses for evil, and not the purple of this settlement here. That's just a goblin settlement that's moved in. There'll actually be a region, a terrain that's actually purple, and I'm not seeing any of it, so this map may very well not have any at all. This boulder-looking spot here at the top in the local and on the region here is a cave where a monster has made its lair. So there's at least a monster not too far from where we're embarking at. Now I'm going to cover some of the other screens here. If you tab through these, you're going to get a list of not just your biomes, but also neighbors you can expect. If you see tower on this, you can expect to see a necromancer invading your fortress at some point in the future. This will warn you if your civilization is at war with any of the races. This civilization screen lets you pick which civilization you're part of. For the purposes of our playthrough tonight, I'm going to use the godly gear. If I tab back to my neighbors, if I were to pick a different civilization, it's possible, for example, that I might be at war with the elves on some of these. The goblins, of course, you're pretty much always at war, either openly or not openly. But you could conceivably be at war with the humans, goblins, and elves from the start of your game if you pick the right civilization on the right world with the right history. Some people like that sort of game. For purposes of a new player tutorial, it's a little aggressive to start that way. Relative elevation is basically what you'd expect from a height or topography map. It shows, roughly speaking, the elevation of things next to one another. So northeast of where we're embarking, there's some hills and cliffs in this area here, which correspond to this scale as it goes up. We're at a fairly low elevation. We match this low marker here. The cliffiness indicator is a little confusing at first, and what it pertains to is how broken, how multi-level an area is. 0 means that it's perfectly flat, for example. 1 means that there's some cliffs, but it's like a gradual slope. There'll be an occasional 1-level change or 2-level change. These 8s, 9s, and asterisks here are highly cliffy, mountainous type terrain. So for those of you looking to embark on a mountainside, for example, that's really what you're looking for, is this rapidly changing terrain. And what this really corresponds to is how many vertical changes there are in a given sub-region of your map. So the northeast corner, for example, if I were to move my embark rectangle 1 spot to the east, the northeast corner of this map would have a high peak in it on my map with a slightly lower cliff to this point, and it would slope down to a flat area as I move to the southwest. For our purposes tonight, I'm going to run this on a flat map so you guys can not have to worry about the issues that occasionally arise with multiple heights. Those of you looking to embark in a more traditional dwarven setting are strongly encouraged to go out there and find a mountain, but we're not going to use one tonight. Aside from the biomes, this is a good opportunity for me to display one of the additional tools that DF Hack provides for analyzing an embark. Now, those of you who've played Dwarf Fortress and you're looking for a particular group of stones or ores, or maybe you're looking for coal, it can really be a pain to have to embark all the time, not find what you're looking for, abandon your fortress, go back out, look some more, abandon, go back out, look some more. It might be 3, 4, 10, 100 fortresses before you find exactly what you're looking to find. DF Hack provides a solution for this. This borderline cheaty, so those of you playing along at home who may not want to do that sort of thing, avert your eyes now, and I'm going to go ahead and show you how this works. DF Hack has a tool called Prospect, which will allow you to display the contents of your map. How many of what type of stone, how many of what types of gems, wood, you name it. It's all here. I generally, if I'm looking for something in particular, I will look at Prospect All before I embark. It's not a perfect number. You won't, if you mined out the entire world, you probably wouldn't find exactly 900 turquoises, but it will give you a rough idea of what you should expect. And in particular, one of the useful things you can get out of this is up here at the very top section where it tells you about the layers of stone you're going to see. You can go out to the wiki and you can find out what types of metals, for example, show up in an obsidian layer, or what marble is used for. Hint, it's a flux for making steel. You can find out that clay loam can be used as a clay, as its name describes, but some types of sand that say clay don't necessarily get to use as clay, like sandy clay loam, I don't believe actually can be used as sand or clay. This tells me that I'm going to see phyllite and rhyolite and all of these, and you can look up what these are, whether they're magma safe, and all their various features and functions on the wiki. This second section deals with the metals I'm going to see. My site's going to have tetrahedrite hematite, which is an ore of iron, copper, malachite, which is also a copper, native gold, and a little bit of garnierite. I would expect to see, roughly speaking, that there is a lot of tetrahedrite, a lot of hematite, a lot of native copper, and then it falls off pretty sharply after that. So those other metals will be there, but they'll probably be trace, hard to find, and not really worth excavating for. You can pay attention to the gems if you're looking for a particular type. Personally, I've never actually picked an embark based on what type of gems I see. Your mileage may vary. Other vein stones include microcline, which is a nice light blue color, cobaltite, which is a dark blue color, mica, which is magma safe, cinnabar, which is a reddish color. If you're looking to construct something of a particular color, for example, these other vein stones may very well be something you want to pay attention to for color purposes. This is basically the palette of color that you'll have on site to work with. There's nothing that stops you from importing whatever color stone you want, but if you're going to build a 200 level tall pyramid out of red stone, and there's no red stone on your map, it's going to be a long time before you get done, because your imports are going to be very slow and only happen about once a year. You're going to have to play a long time to finish up that pyramid. As with the warning here, it tells you, this is a rough estimate. Don't count on there being exactly this much microcline. But you should expect that the stuff that shows up and has 5 or 6 digits probably shows up a lot more than the stuff that shows up with 3 or 4 digits. Or this ilmenite here is actually reporting 0. I'm pretty sure there's some. It's just it doesn't know how much. Now, Prospect is one of those useful tools. If I were looking for coal, for example, I would skip this map. I would not embark here because there's no coal listed anywhere in this at all. If I were looking for a map that had flux for steel, for example, and it didn't have marble, and it didn't have any of the other stone types that I can use as flux, then I wouldn't want to embark there either. This basically allows you to scan through the map and view what you can expect to find before you get started. Now, one thing you do need to watch when you do this is that you'll notice I have one biome selected here, F1. If I hit F2, and I go back and I run Prospect All again, I get a different readout. These amounts will differ. At least they should. Maybe they've changed it since the last time I did this. It should be only reporting the one biome, but it looks like it may be reporting both. So we'll skip that and move on. I'm not following you there, Print. What visible area are you referring to? the area scan for minerals is going to, it doesn't do this section over here that doesn't correspond to the section of my embark. So it's within this 5 by 5 boundary at all times. So if I were to move my embark rectangle